You lose your temper, you yell, and as the words leave your mouth, you freeze. Because that wasn't your voice. That was your father's voice. Or maybe your mother's.
Yeah, that's a terrifying moment.
It really is. Welcome to The Debate. Today we're staring down something incredibly uncomfortable, the generational ghost. We're asking what really happens when we snap. Like when a modern parent echoes the toxic, angry, or emotionally unavailable behaviors of their own parents, how do we make sense of it?
Right. The core question is, are you just an exhausted adult trying to maintain order? Or are you biologically defaulting to the trauma you survived as a kid?
Exactly. And I look at this from a pragmatic angle. I think that while this echo is jarring, it's mostly just a normal part of growing up and hitting the wall of extreme adult exhaustion. It's the messy, unglamorous transmission of structure and authority under immense pressure. I mean, we shouldn't necessarily label ourselves as monsters just for losing our temper.
And I actually look at this from a completely different angle. I'm going to argue that brushing this off as just being tired or establishing structure is a massive red flag.
A red flag?
Yes, a highly dangerous defense mechanism that masks untreated generational trauma. This isn't about setting boundaries. It's about the nervous system defaulting to the exact abuse it survived.
Well, to really dig into this, I think we have to start by acknowledging the crushing weight of modern parenting. I mean, millions of adults grow up swearing they will never, ever treat their children the way their parents treated them.
Oh, absolutely. They're fueled by this youthful idealism, right? A firm promise to break the cycle.
Right. But then they actually have kids. And the source material we're looking at explicitly points to moments of extreme stress or exhaustion, when you are profoundly sleep-deprived, when financial pressures are mounting.
The reality sets in.
Exactly. When a toddler or a teenager is testing every conceivable boundary you have, that youthful idealism just shatters against the wall of reality. What we often label as a ghost or a haunting is actually just a sobering induction into adulthood.
So you're saying they finally get it?
Yeah, you suddenly understand why your parents were so hard on you. Adopting similar tones or words is often just the difficult but entirely necessary application of discipline. I mean, we have created a culture that expects endless patience, but authority requires a firmness that isn't always pretty.
Sure, firmness is one thing.
But see, the so-called monster isn't real. It's just the heavy burden of setting boundaries when your tank is completely empty.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. We are not talking about a parent deciding to implement a firmer curfew or thoughtfully adopting a more authoritative posture.
But stress makes thoughtfulness hard?
Wait, hear me out. The text is incredibly specific in defining this as the generational ghost. That is a terrifying psychological reality where untreated trauma is literally hardwired into the nervous system. The source material states that this happens without warning.
Without warning.
Yes.
And that the parent uses the exact same tone, the exact same cruel words, and the exact same facial expression their toxic parents used on them decades ago. This is not a conscious choice of structure.
You're saying it's involuntary.
It is a biological hijacking. When an adult reverts to the exact cruel words of an emotionally unavailable abuser, the cycle hasn't broken. They haven't suddenly become wise and authoritative. They have been possessed by the trauma they survived, and in that moment of exhaustion, they've simply taken over the role of the villain in the exact same script.
I want to push back on that, but honestly, part of me is terrified you're right. If this is truly hardwired, how do we even begin to untangle it? I mean, are you saying we have zero agency in those moments of exhaustion?
Not zero agency, but severely compromised agency. Because if we look at the mechanics of extreme stress, when a human being is pushed beyond their cognitive limits, the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for complex decision-making, emotional regulation, all those modern parenting ideals, it essentially powers down.
Right, the logic center goes offline.
Exactly. What is left behind are the primal, deeply ingrained tools of authority. The tools that were modeled for you are the tools you reach for when the luxury of infinite patience is stripped away. It doesn't mean you're traumatizing your child. It means you're human and you're tired.
But the child doesn't know the difference between lost patience and abuse. And the brain science actually explains exactly why this happens in such a terrifyingly specific way.
Okay, let's hear it.
You mentioned the prefrontal cortex powering down. That's true. But what powers up? When you're exhausted, your amygdala, the brain's threat detection alarm system, takes over. It bypasses the logical part of your brain entirely and activates what psychologists call a state-dependent memory response.
So it's basically hitting an emergency switch.
Think of it like a computer defaulting to safe mode when it crashes. Your brain defaults to the exact survival script it learned in childhood. Under severe physiological stress, the nervous system doesn't just look for a generic tool of authority. It defaults to the deepest neural pathways available.
Okay, but let's break that down for a second. If it's just defaulting to a neural pathway, isn't that just a learned habit? Why do we have to frame it as this catastrophic trauma response?
Let me use an analogy. Think of your brain under extreme stress like an old dirt road.
Okay, dirt road?
Your conscious, gentle parenting ideals are fresh pavement laid over the top of that road. But when the heavy storm of exhaustion hits, that fresh pavement washes away, and your tires inevitably fall into the deep, muddy ruts that your parents carved out decades ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If those ruts were carved out in an environment of toxicity, anger, and emotional unavailability, your nervous system recreates that exact environment. You see it in the physical body. The hot flush of the face, the tightness in the chest, the sudden ringing in the ears.
The adrenaline response.
Right. That is your vagus nerve preparing you to fight a life or death threat. Only the threat is your crying child. It is not an intellectual parenting strategy. It is a profound failure of emotional regulation where the parent is biologically transported back to their own childhood trauma. Only this time, they are the one inflicting it.
That's a highly vivid way to put it. And I understand the dirt road analogy, I really do. But let me pivot here, because we have to talk about the reality of the people living this.
Sure.
If you're listening to this on your commute right now and thinking, wait, I yelled at my kid this morning, does this mean I'm toxic? Am I the monster? We really need to unpack that. Because I think pathologizing every loss of temper as a generational ghost is far too punishing for the modern parent.
It's not every loss of temper, though. It's the specific, unprompted replication of the abuse they suffered. That's the distinction the text makes.
Right, but we must distinguish between the subjective experience of the parent and the objective reality of the action. When a parent loses their temper and yells, they feel an immense rush of guilt.
Of course they do.
They hear the echo of their own parents, they freeze, and they immediately jump to the worst possible conclusion. I have become the abuser. We are asking parents to not only raise children under immense societal pressure, but to do so while constantly policing their own tone to ensure it doesn't accidentally sound like a prior generation.
But they should police their tone if it's harmful.
Yes, but normalizing the fact that parents are fallible, that they will sometimes yell, and that it doesn't inherently make them a monster, that is a necessary psychological defense. If we don't normalize it, we risk a complete psychological collapse of the parent.
And I argue that normalizing this behavior as a defense mechanism is incredibly dangerous. Precisely because it is a defense mechanism for the parent's ego, not a protection for the child.
But if the parent collapses, who helps the child?
I hear you, but if we rationalize the use of exact, cruel words as just normal human fallibility, we are basically giving ourselves permission to continue the abuse. The source material doesn't frame this as a minor slip in patience. It frames it as a deep, terrifying psychological horror.
Terrifying for the parent, yes.
And for the child. The true horror isn't just about the parent's internal feelings of guilt on their commute. It is looking at your child's terrified face and realizing they're looking at you the exact same way you used to look at your abusive parent.
That is a very heavy thought.
It's the reality of it. When you normalize that, when you say, well, I'm just tired, my fresh pavement washed away, this is what discipline looks like, you are invalidating the very real terror in your child's eyes. You're demanding that your child absorb your unhealed trauma so that you don't have to do the agonizing work of confronting it.
But wait, if we accept your premise that this is a biological hijacking, what happens when the dust settles? Because let's look at the aftermath. Let's look at the moment the text highlights, the freezing.
The realization.
Yes. The toxic parent didn't freeze. Their toxic parent didn't feel horror at their own reflection. The fact that the modern parent recognizes the voice, the fact that they freeze and feel that chilling realization, proves that they have not completely become their toxic parent. The modern parent's guilt is evidence of their empathy.
Empathy is a starting point, yes, but empathy without behavioral change is just a different flavor of manipulation.
Ouch. I'm not saying we stop at empathy, but how do they move forward from that freeze? If we adopt your framework, they are a vessel for a generational curse, actively destroying their child. I argue we must offer ourselves grace in that exact moment.
Grace for cruelty?
Grace for being human. If we believe we are monsters, we will behave like monsters. Acknowledging that our inherited tools are flawed, but forgiving ourselves for relying on them when we are exhausted, is the only pragmatic way to continue functioning as a caregiver. You just can't parent from a place of constant self-loathing.
But offering yourself grace without demanding structural change within your own nervous system is just a polite way of abandoning your child to your own demons. This brings us to the heartbreaking climax of this entirely shared reality.
Which is what?
The scariest part of this psychological phenomenon is not simply hearing your toxic parent's voice in your own throat. The visceral, terrifying part is the crushing, inescapable guilt of knowing you are actively passing your unhealed childhood trauma directly onto your own kids.
Yeah, that is definitely the core fear.
You can have all the empathy and all the guilt after the fact, but if the cruel words have already left your mouth, the ghost has already struck. The ghost hasn't disappeared. It is using you to haunt the next generation. That realization shouldn't be met with self-forgiveness as a first step. It must be met with absolute unflinching accountability.
Accountability is absolutely necessary, but accountability requires a functional ego to implement. If the guilt is truly inescapable and absolute, as you suggest, it leads to paralysis.
How so?
Well, the parent becomes so terrified of their own shadow, so hyper-vigilant about accidentally letting the ghost slip out, that they retreat. They pull away from their kids entirely to protect them from the monster. They retreat into emotional unavailability, which ironically is one of the exact toxic traits outlined in the source text that caused the trauma in the first place. We're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy here.
That's a compelling argument, I admit. But have you considered that the paralysis you describe is exactly why the text calls it a psychological horror? There is no easy, comfortable way out of this.
No, there isn't.
The realization that you contain the monster you swore to destroy is profoundly destabilizing. It shatters the illusion that just by wanting to be different, you are different. The trauma is hardwired. It sits in those deep, muddy ruts, waiting for the precise level of exhaustion to trigger it. When you look in the mirror and see the monster staring back, you aren't just seeing a tired parent who needs a nap and a little bit of grace. You are seeing the culmination of generations of unhealed pain that has successfully found a new host.
Let's really examine that word host and the concept of possession used here. The text says the ghost of their parents hasn't disappeared. It has possessed them. But possession implies a complete loss of agency. It implies you are a passenger in your own body.
In that split second, you basically are.
If we follow the pragmatic view, agency is never entirely lost. The exhaustion just lowers the threshold for impulsive behavior. Millions of adults face this exact mirror moment. The fact that it is a universal experience suggests it is a feature of human development under extreme duress, not an anomaly of untreated clinical trauma.
I still think that minimizes the impact.
Listen. We build these incredibly high expectations for modern parenting based on an upper-middle-class luxury of time, endless emotional bandwidth, and a perfectly regulated nervous system. When those resources are stripped away by the reality of life, the resulting sternness, even if it mimics past generations, is an attempt to maintain order in chaos.
Maintaining order in chaos with cruel words is the definition of toxic parenting. It doesn't matter if the chaos is caused by modern financial stress or historical circumstance.
But intent matters.
The child receiving the exact cruel tone doesn't care about the parent's cognitive load. They don't care that your prefrontal cortex is powered down. They only know that their parent, their supposed safe harbor, has inexplicably turned into a threat. The text makes a specific point to emphasize the exact same cruel words.
Right, the specificity.
Yes, that specificity is the linchpin of the trauma argument. It is a precise replication. If a parent is simply trying to maintain order, they might yell, "Go to your room," or "I can't deal with this right now." But if they yell the precise, cutting, psychologically dismantling phrases that were used to destroy their own self-esteem 30 years ago, that is the ghost operating the machinery. It is not an attempted order. It is a regurgitation of poison.
I hear the weight of what you're saying, I really do. And I think to summarize my position in light of where this discussion has gone, the echo of our parents in our own voices is undoubtedly a jarring, chilling experience that forces us to confront our own limitations. When the muddy ruts of our past catch our tires, it is terrifying.
Very much so.
However, we must be incredibly careful not to confuse the desperate, unglamorous realities of parental exhaustion with literal trauma-driven monstrousness. The overwhelming stress of raising children naturally strips away our idealized versions of ourselves, leaving behind the primal tools of authority we witnessed growing up. Recognizing this as a difficult but normal facet of adult responsibility allows us to correct our behavior without being crushed by unwarranted, paralyzing guilt that ultimately serves no one, not the parent, and certainly not the child.
And to summarize my position, until we recognize this exact mimicry for what it is, hardwired generational trauma, we will remain possessed by the ghosts of our past. Normalizing these outbursts as mere parental exhaustion is a defense mechanism. It protects the parent's ego while leaving the child completely vulnerable to the exact same cyclical abuse.
We definitely disagree on the degree of harm there.
But the harm is real. When we use the identical tones, expressions, and cruelties of our toxic parents, we are failing to protect our children from the very pain we endured. The psychological horror is real. The physiological response is real, and it demands rigorous accountability and treatment, not soft justification.
I believe we can both acknowledge, though, that this is a deeply unsettling, yet nearly universal parental experience.
Without a doubt, it is something almost everyone faces at some point.
There is profound value in looking at these intense moments of lost temper through both lenses, understanding the pragmatic, biological reality of exhaustion and the need for grace, while never losing sight of the deep psychological trauma that might be silently shaping our reactions. There is clearly much more to explore in how we manage the inheritance of our past. Look in the mirror. The cycle doesn't break itself. You can either face the ghost or you can become it. The choice is yours.